10 minutes before a White House military reception began, my husband laughed in my face and asked why I was still chasing that little military career. 10 minutes later, an admiral called my name in front of everyone in the room. I've replayed that night more times than I can count. Not because of the applause, not because of the cameras, and certainly not because of what happened to Daniel afterward. I remember it because that was the exact moment I finally stopped trying to earn respect from someone who had already decided I didn't deserve it. My name is Rebecca Morgan. I'm 47 years old, originally from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and at the time of this story, I was a colonel in the U.S. Army Reserve. I'd been married to Daniel Morgan for 19 years. For most of those years, I thought we were partners. Looking back, I realized we were living two different marriages. The morning of the reception started in our hotel room at the Willard Intercontinental in Washington, D.C. I woke up before sunrise the way I always do when I'm nervous. The city outside was still quiet. A few headlights moved along Pennsylvania Avenue. Somewhere below, a delivery truck backed into an alley with that familiar beeping sound. Daniel was asleep, or at least pretending to be. I sat near the window with a cup of hotel coffee and looked over my notes one last time. Not because I was scheduled to speak. At least that's what most people believed, including my husband, especially my husband. A few minutes later, he rolled over and glanced toward me. "You're up already." "Couldn't sleep." He stretched. "You act like you're heading into combat." I smiled politely. "Old habit," he laughed. Not cruelly, not yet, just dismissively, like someone humoring a child. By 8 o'clock, he was on his phone answering emails from his insurance offices back in Virginia. Daniel owned 3 insurance agencies. He worked hard. I'll always give him credit for that. But over the years, success had changed him. Or maybe it simply revealed who he'd always been. Everything became a ranking system. Income, status, connections, influence. If he couldn't measure something financially, he usually dismissed it. Military service was one of those things. When we first met in our 20s, he thought my reserve career was admirable. Years later, he called it a government side project. I wish I could tell you that comment shocked me. It didn't. By then, comments like that had become routine. Around noon, Claire arrived. Officially, she was Daniel's executive assistant. Unofficially, well, let's just say I wasn't the only one who noticed how often she traveled with him. Claire was in her early 30s, smart, ambitious, always perfectly dressed. She knocked on our hotel room door carrying garment bags. Daniel opened it immediately. Perfect timing. Her smile appeared the second she saw him. Then she noticed me. "Oh, hi, Rebecca." Not Colonel. Not Rebecca and Daniel. Just Rebecca. Like I was some distant cousin. I helped myself to another cup of coffee and watched them discuss schedules. At one point, Claire adjusted Daniel's tie. Neither of them seemed to think that was unusual. Maybe it wasn't. Maybe I was imagining things. For months, I'd been asking myself that question. And every time I did, I felt a little smaller. By late afternoon, we were heading toward the White House complex. The reception was being held in one of the formal event spaces used for military recognition programs. Security was tight, uniforms everywhere, service members from every branch, decorated officers, senior civilians, military families, the kind of event most Americans never get the opportunity to attend. I was wearing my Army dress blue uniform. Daniel wore a tailored black suit. Claire wore an elegant navy dress. As we approached the entrance, I noticed something. Daniel and Claire naturally drifted ahead together. Not intentionally, not dramatically, just comfortably, like people who had spent a lot of time doing exactly that. I followed several steps behind. Funny how 19 years of marriage can sometimes feel longer than a 1,000-mile deployment. The reception line moved slowly. A Marine checked identification. Guests chatted quietly. Soft music drifted from inside. Then Daniel turned around and noticed me joining the line. A grin spread across his face. The kind I had learned to recognize. The one that meant he was about to say something he considered funny. "Still doing this?" I frowned. "Doing what?" He gestured toward my uniform. "The military thing." Claire laughed. Daniel continued. "You've got almost 20 years in, isn't it enough?" A couple nearby glanced toward us. I felt heat rise in my face. Not anger. Embarrassment. The familiar kind. The kind that comes from being belittled by someone who knows exactly where to aim. Then he leaned closer. Still chasing that little military career, Claire immediately joined in. Some people just don't know when to quit. For a second, I considered responding. I had 100 responses, maybe 1,000. Instead, I looked away. Arguing never changed anything. Not with Daniel. Not anymore. The line moved forward. Daniel and Claire handed over their credentials. Everything processed smoothly. Then it was my turn. I stepped forward and handed my invitation to the hostess. She smiled professionally. "Good evening, ma'am." She scanned the QR code. Then her smile disappeared. Not in a bad way. More like confusion. She looked at the screen. Looked again. Then straightened slightly. My stomach tightened. Had there been a mistake? For months I'd worried something would go wrong. The project had become so much larger than I ever imagined. Maybe there had been a last-minute change. Maybe my paperwork. Then the hostess turned. An admiral stood nearby speaking with several guests. She approached him immediately. I heard her voice. Quiet. Respectful. But clear enough for us to hear. "Sir?" The admiral looked over. "Yes." She nodded toward me. "She's here." The admiral's face instantly brightened. And then he started walking directly toward me. Daniel's smile vanished. The admiral stopped a few feet in front of me. For a moment nobody said anything. The conversations around us seemed to fade into the background. Then he smiled and extended his hand. "Colonel Morgan." I shook it. "Good evening, Admiral." "It's good to finally see you here." I thanked him, trying to keep my composure. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw Daniel staring. Not confused. Not yet. Concerned. The Admiral exchanged a few polite words before being pulled away by another guest. The hostess escorted me inside. Daniel and Claire followed several steps behind. Neither one seemed quite as comfortable as they had been 5 minutes earlier. Good. Not because I wanted revenge. At least not then. I simply wanted them to experience what I had experienced for years. That uncomfortable feeling of realizing you may not know as much as you thought you did. As we entered the reception hall, I found myself thinking about how I got there. Not the White House. The military. Because the truth is, I never planned to spend most of my adult life in uniform. I grew up in Cedar Rapids, Iowa. My father worked maintenance for the school district. My mother was a nurse. We weren't poor. We weren't wealthy. We were one of those families that fixed things instead of replacing them. My dad could repair almost anything with duct tape, a wrench, and enough stubbornness. When I graduated high school in 1997, I wasn't sure what I wanted. I attended Kirkwood Community College, worked part-time, paid my bills, lived a pretty ordinary life. The Army Reserve entered the picture almost by accident. A recruiter visited campus. I listened, asked questions, signed up. My parents thought I was crazy. A lot of people did. At 22, I wasn't chasing glory. I was looking for direction. What I found instead was purpose. Not immediately. The first few years were difficult. Early mornings, training weekends, long drives, learning how to lead, learning how to fail, learning how to get back up afterward. The military didn't make me special. It made me accountable. And over time, that changed everything. I met Daniel when I was 28. He was funny back then. Confident without being arrogant. Or at least that's how he appeared. Our first date was at a little Italian restaurant outside Des Moines. I remember him asking about the Army. He seemed genuinely interested. "What do you actually do?" I explained logistics. Transportation planning. Personnel coordination. Supply movement. His eyes glazed over. "That sounds incredibly boring." Then he laughed. I laughed too. At the time it felt harmless. Looking back, maybe that was the first clue. Most people imagine military service as helicopters, combat, and dramatic missions. My work was different. When things went well, nobody noticed. When things went wrong, everybody noticed. My job was making sure people had what they needed where they needed it. Simple on paper, complicated in reality. As the years passed, my responsibilities grew. So did my rank. Meanwhile, Daniel's business expanded. He opened additional offices, hired employees, started attending networking events. His world became larger. Mine became more demanding. For a while, we made it work. Then something changed. I think it happened gradually, the way rust forms. You don't notice it at first. Then one day the damage is impossible to ignore. Daniel stopped asking questions about my work, stopped attending ceremonies, stopped showing interest. When I was promoted to lieutenant colonel, he sent flowers. He didn't come. When I completed a major command assignment, he forgot about it entirely. When I became a full colonel, he was supposed to attend the ceremony in Arlington. He canceled the night before. Golf tournament. More important clients. Better opportunity. There was always a reason. One excuse after another. I told myself not to take it personally. But eventually it becomes personal. Especially when you're sitting alone afterward looking at empty chairs. The hardest part wasn't the missed events. It was the way he talked about them afterward. Like they never mattered. One evening years earlier, we attended a dinner party in Alexandria. Several couples. Good food. Wine. Typical conversation. Someone asked what I did. Before I could answer, Daniel smiled. "Oh, Rebecca works part-time for the government." Everybody laughed, including me. That's what people do in those situations. They laugh. They pretend it doesn't hurt. But I remember driving home afterward in complete silence. I remember staring out the passenger window. I remember wondering why the joke bothered me so much. The answer was simple. Because it wasn't really a joke. It was how he saw me. By the time we reached our late 40s, our marriage had become something comfortable from the outside and lonely underneath. We weren't fighting constantly. We weren't screaming. We were simply drifting. And drifting can be harder to recognize than conflict. A marriage can survive arguments. It struggles to survive indifference. The project that eventually brought me to the White House started 3 years before the reception. At first, it wasn't even supposed to be my project. I was assigned to review delays affecting military families after serious injuries or deaths. What I found shocked me. Paperwork lost between agencies, benefits delayed, widows waiting months for answers, families making dozens of phone calls just to receive information. People already experiencing the worst moments of their lives were being buried in bureaucracy. I couldn't stop thinking about it. So I started working on solutions. After hours, weekends, conference calls, meetings, research. Slowly the idea grew. Then it became a pilot program. Then a national initiative. Thousands of military families eventually benefited. But at home, very little changed. Daniel rarely asked what I was working on. And when he did, he usually lost interest before I finished answering. Which is why he never knew how important the project had become. Not because I hid it, because he stopped listening. As the reception continued around us, I watched guests mingle beneath crystal chandeliers and historic portraits. Daniel stood near the bar talking quietly with Claire. Every so often he glanced toward me, trying to figure something out, trying to solve a puzzle he never realized existed. Then the lights dimmed slightly. People began moving toward their seats. A stage stood at the front of the room, an American flag beside it, a Navy flag on the opposite side. The Admiral approached the podium. The room gradually fell silent. I felt my pulse quicken, because I knew what was coming. And for the first time all evening, I wasn't worried about Daniel. I was worried about myself, about whether I was ready for what happened next. The Admiral adjusted the microphone and looked out across the room. Nearly 300 people had taken their seats. Senior officers, military families, civilian leaders, veterans, a few members of Congress. The quiet settled in slowly. Silverware stopped clinking. Conversations faded. Even the servers paused. I sat at a table near the front. Daniel and Claire sat 2 tables behind me. Close enough to see everything. Close enough to hear everything. The Admiral smiled. "Good evening, ladies and gentlemen." A round of applause followed. He thanked several organizations, recognized distinguished guests, and spoke briefly about military families. Then his tone shifted. More personal, more deliberate, and my stomach tightened. "Before we begin tonight's program," he said, "I'd like to recognize someone whose work has changed the lives of thousands of American military families." I lowered my eyes. Suddenly the room felt too warm. The Admiral continued. 3 years ago, we identified serious gaps in support systems for wounded service members and surviving spouses. A few people nodded. Many already knew the issue. The delays had been frustrating for years. The officer who helped solve those problems is in this room tonight. I heard Daniel's chair move. The Admiral glanced toward my table, and then he said my name. Colonel Rebecca Morgan. For a moment I couldn't move. The applause started softly, then grew louder. People began turning toward me. I stood. My heart hammered against my ribs. The Admiral smiled. "There she is." The room erupted, not because I was famous, not because I was important, but because many of the people in that room had worked on the same problem. They knew how difficult it had been. They knew how many obstacles had stood in the way, and they understood what the program had accomplished. I looked across the room. Daniel was staring, not applauding, just staring. Claire's expression was even more interesting. Her smile had completely disappeared. The confident look she'd worn all evening was gone. The Admiral continued speaking. He described the initiative, the long hours, the pilot programs, the partnerships between agencies, the improvements in response times, families receiving help faster, widows getting answers sooner, wounded veterans receiving support without endless paperwork. Several people stood. Then more followed. Suddenly the entire room was on its feet. I felt embarrassed, grateful, overwhelmed, all at once. I wasn't used to public attention. Most military work happens quietly. That's how I preferred it. But there was more. Much more. The Admiral raised a hand for silence. I also have another announcement. The room settled again. I felt a strange knot form in my stomach. Because now we were moving beyond the part Daniel didn't know, into the part almost nobody knew. The Admiral smiled directly at me. Colonel Morgan's leadership has earned recognition at the highest levels. I swallowed. And suddenly every conversation I'd had over the previous 6 months flashed through my mind. The paperwork, the interviews, the reviews, the secrecy, the waiting, the endless waiting. Tonight, the Admiral continued, "We are honored to recognize Colonel Morgan as the recipient of the Presidential Distinguished Civil Military Leadership Award." For a second the room went completely silent. Then came another wave of applause, louder than before, much louder. I heard someone whistle. Another person shouted congratulations. Several people stood again. I felt my eyes begin to sting, not because of the award, because of what it represented. 25 years of work, 25 years of sacrifice, 25 years of showing up, even when nobody noticed, especially when nobody noticed. The Admiral invited me to the stage. My legs felt strangely unsteady as I walked forward. The room blurred. The lights seemed brighter than before. I accepted the award, shook hands, smiled for photographs, answered a few brief questions. The entire process probably lasted 5 minutes. It felt like 30 seconds. When it was over, I returned to my seat. And that's when things started getting interesting. Because Daniel suddenly became very interested in my military career. Imagine that. 5 minutes earlier, he could barely hide his boredom. Now he couldn't stop watching me. A reception break followed the presentation. Guests immediately approached. People introduced themselves. Several military spouses thanked me. One widow from North Carolina hugged me. Actually hugged me. She told me the program had helped her family after her husband died unexpectedly. I didn't know what to say. I never do in those moments. You just listen and hope you did something useful. As the crowd grew around me, I noticed Daniel trying to push through. Reporters had appeared. Photographers. Event organizers. Everyone wanted a few minutes. Daniel suddenly wanted a few minutes too. Funny how that works. When he finally reached me, his smile looked forced. "Rebecca." I turned. "Hi." His voice was softer than usual, almost careful. "Why didn't you tell me?" There it was. The question. The one I'd been expecting. I looked at him. Really looked at him. And for the first time I realized something. He honestly believed he was the victim, as though information had been hidden from him, as though I had kept some enormous secret. The truth was much simpler. I hadn't hidden anything. He just hadn't listened. "You never asked." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. For once Daniel had no response. Before he could recover, another guest approached. Daniel stepped aside, and that's when I noticed Claire, standing alone, watching everything. She looked nervous. Not jealous, nervous, which struck me as odd. Then an unexpected memory surfaced. 3 weeks earlier, a travel confirmation, an email chain, a brief conversation I'd overheard. Pieces that hadn't seemed important at the time, until now. Because suddenly I realized something. Claire may have known about the award, long before Daniel did. And if she knew, that raised a much bigger question. Why hadn't she told him? I watched her from across the room. She immediately looked away. That's when I knew. Something else had been happening behind the scenes. Something I hadn't noticed before. And before the evening was over, I was going to find out exactly what it was. I spent most of my career believing that truth eventually reveals itself. Not quickly, not dramatically, just steadily. Like sunlight creeping across a room. What happened during the next hour proved that idea right. The reception continued after the ceremony. People moved between tables. Servers carried trays of appetizers. Small groups formed throughout the ballroom. The atmosphere had shifted. Earlier, I had been another guest in uniform. Now people recognized my name. That part felt strange. I was still adjusting to it. A reporter from Military Times asked about the Family Support Initiative. Then another journalist from Stars and Stripes joined us. A woman from a military spouse organization requested an interview. Every conversation focused on the work, the program, the families, exactly the way I wanted it. Unfortunately, Daniel wanted something else. Recognition. For himself. I noticed it immediately. He kept drifting closer whenever cameras appeared. Whenever someone asked me a question, Daniel somehow ended up nearby. At first it seemed harmless. Then it became obvious. One reporter extended a hand toward him. "And you are—" Daniel smiled. "I'm Rebecca's husband." The reporter nodded politely. "That must be exciting." Daniel laughed. "It has been quite a journey. I've supported her through this entire process." I nearly choked on my coffee. Supported me. The man had skipped most of my military ceremonies. He couldn't explain the difference between active duty and reserve service. Yet somehow he was presenting himself as my biggest supporter. I said nothing. I wanted to. Lord knows I wanted to. But I didn't. Because I had learned something over the years. When people start rewriting history in public, the truth usually shows up on its own. About 15 minutes later it did. A retired Army general named Thomas Reed approached our group. I'd known him for over a decade. Not well, but enough. He had mentored many younger officers, including me. The reporter immediately recognized him. "General Reed." They shook hands. Then the reporter smiled. "You must be proud of Colonel Morgan." The general nodded. "Absolutely." The reporter gestured toward Daniel. "And her husband has apparently supported her throughout the entire journey." I saw Daniel straighten slightly. Proud. Confident. Ready to enjoy the compliment. Then General Reed tilted his head. A puzzled expression crossed his face. "Really?" The room became very quiet. Daniel's smile faltered. The general continued. "That's interesting." Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then he added, "I attended 4 of Rebecca's promotion ceremonies." He paused. "I don't remember seeing him at any of them." Silence. Complete silence. The kind that feels louder than shouting. The reporter blinked. Daniel looked stunned. I looked down at my coffee, trying very hard not to smile. The general wasn't being cruel. That was the funny part. He genuinely seemed confused, as though he were trying to solve a factual discrepancy. The reporter glanced at Daniel. Daniel cleared his throat. "I had business commitments." General Reed nodded politely. "That's unfortunate." Then he turned back toward me. Conversation over. Daniel suddenly found the carpet fascinating. I should have felt satisfied. Instead, I felt tired. Deeply tired. Because one awkward moment couldn't erase years of disappointment. It simply exposed them. And exposure has a way of creating momentum. A few minutes later, another surprise arrived. A military widow named Sharon approached. I recognized her immediately. We had spoken countless times during the development of the family support program. She hugged me warmly. Then she turned toward the small group of reporters. "I'll never forget what Colonel Morgan did for us." I tried to redirect the attention. "Sharon—" "No." She shook her head. "They should know." The room listened. Sharon explained how her husband had died unexpectedly during training. She described the paperwork delays, the confusion, the financial stress. Then she explained how our team helped resolve the situation. At one point, she became emotional. Several people did, including me. Because Sharon wasn't talking about policies. She was talking about her life, her children, her future. And suddenly the award felt less important than ever. This was the real reason we did the work. Not ceremonies, not recognition. People. Real people. Meanwhile, Daniel looked increasingly uncomfortable. The spotlight was moving farther and farther away from him. Then things became genuinely awkward. For Claire, a journalist approached her unexpectedly. At first, I didn't think much of it. Then I noticed the look on Claire's face. Recognition. The journalist frowned. "Have we met before?" Claire hesitated. "Maybe." The journalist snapped his fingers. "Chicago." Claire went pale. My attention sharpened immediately. The reporter continued. "You traveled with Daniel Morgan's company last year, right?" Daniel froze. Claire froze. I froze. The journalist smiled innocently. "I covered that insurance conference." Nobody said anything. Then the reporter laughed. Small world. Maybe it was. Maybe it wasn't. But the reaction between Daniel and Claire told me everything I needed to know. Neither of them looked comfortable. Not even a little. For the first time all evening, I stopped questioning my instincts. For months, I'd sensed something was wrong. Late-night texts. Unexpected trips. Inside jokes. The constant closeness. Every concern had been explained away. Every doubt dismissed. Now I was watching 2 people panic because of a simple question. That told me plenty. Not everything, but enough. As the evening continued, Claire gradually disappeared toward the far side of the ballroom. Daniel tried following me several times. I stayed busy. Not intentionally. I simply preferred talking to people who actually wanted to discuss something meaningful. Near the end of the reception, Daniel finally cornered me near a display honoring military families. His expression looked different now. Less confident. Almost desperate. "Can we talk?" I sighed. "We're talking." "Not here." I folded my arms. For years I would have immediately agreed. Not tonight. "What's wrong?" I asked. He stared at me. Then at the award in my hand. Then back at me. And suddenly I understood. The problem wasn't that he had discovered something new about me. The problem was that everyone else had. And he hadn't. That realization was eating him alive. For the first time in our marriage, Daniel wasn't controlling the story. And he had no idea what to do about it. The reception ended just after 10 o'clock. Guests slowly filtered out of the ballroom. Some headed back to hotels. Others gathered in small groups around the lobby. Washington was unusually quiet that night. A light rain had started outside. The kind that leaves the sidewalks shining under streetlights. I stood near the entrance holding my award and saying goodbye to people. A few final photographs. A few final handshakes. Then I stepped outside. For the first time all evening I was alone. At least for about 30 seconds. "Rebecca." I heard Daniel's voice behind me. I closed my eyes briefly, then turned around. He stood beneath the hotel awning. No smile. No confidence. No performance. Just Daniel. The version of him I hadn't seen in years, or maybe the version I'd spent years hoping still existed. "We need to talk." There it was again. That sentence. The same one he'd been trying to use all evening. I nodded toward a nearby bench. "Fine." We sat. For a few moments neither of us spoke. Traffic moved along Pennsylvania Avenue. A taxi stopped at the curb. Some tourists walked past carrying umbrellas. Life continued normally, which felt oddly comforting. Eventually, Daniel looked down at his hands. "I didn't know." I laughed softly. Not because it was funny, because it was honest. "No, you didn't. I mean the award, the program, everything." I looked at him carefully. Then I asked the question that had been sitting in my chest for years. "Did you ever want to know?" His eyes lifted toward mine. And for the first time he didn't have an answer. Not a good one anyway. Because we both knew the truth. I hadn't hidden my life from him. I'd talked about meetings, projects, travel, military families, training, promotion boards, long weekends, late-night conference calls. He simply stopped listening somewhere along the way. When someone stops valuing your world, they stop being curious about it. That's what happened. And curiosity is one of the first things to die in a struggling marriage. A long silence settled between us. Then Daniel surprised me. "Claire knew." I nodded. "I figured that out." He rubbed his forehead. "She saw travel documents months ago." I wasn't shocked. Not really. The signs had been there. What else did she know? He hesitated. And that hesitation told me everything. More than words ever could. I didn't ask another question. I didn't need to. The marriage I'd spent years trying to save suddenly felt very clear. Not because of Claire. Not because of one event. Not because of one mistake. Because respect had been gone for a very long time. Without respect, everything else eventually follows. A week later, I met with an attorney. A month later, I filed for divorce. People sometimes ask whether the White House reception caused the divorce. It didn't. The divorce had started years earlier. The reception simply forced us to stop pretending. The legal process wasn't pleasant. Most aren't. There were difficult conversations, painful paperwork, awkward meetings, moments when I questioned myself, moments when I grieved. Because even when you're leaving something unhealthy, you're still leaving something familiar. And that hurts. Daniel tried several times to repair things. I believe he was sincere. At least partially. But sincerity and compatibility aren't always the same thing. By then, too much damage had accumulated. Meanwhile, other changes were happening. Word spread about the award. Articles appeared. Organizations reached out. Military family groups invited me to speak. Not because I was special. Because the program had worked. That's what people cared about. Results. The initiative expanded further. Additional states adopted parts of the framework. Support systems improved. There was still work to do. There always will be. But progress was happening. That mattered. Several months later, I moved into a townhouse in Alexandria, Virginia. Smaller than the house Daniel and I had shared. Quieter, too. At first, the silence felt strange. Then it felt peaceful. For the first time in years, nobody mocked my work. Nobody rolled their eyes when I discussed military families. Nobody treated my career like an inconvenience. I didn't realize how exhausting that had been until it stopped. One afternoon nearly a year later, I attended a leadership event at Fort Belvoir. After the presentation, a young Army captain approached me. She couldn't have been older than 30. She looked nervous. "Colonel Morgan." I smiled. "Yes." She held out her hand. "I just wanted to thank you." "For what?" She laughed. "You probably don't remember this." She explained that years earlier we'd met during a training conference. A brief conversation. 10 minutes at most. Apparently, I'd encouraged her to pursue a leadership position she wasn't sure she could handle. Now she was commanding her own unit. I barely remembered the conversation. But she did. That's the funny thing about life. You never know which moments matter. Sometimes the things that change another person's life feel completely ordinary when they happen. We talked for a few minutes, then she said something I'll never forget. "You made me believe I belonged here." After she left, I sat in my car for a while, thinking. About Iowa. About the Army. About marriage. About all those years. About that night in Washington. The award sits on a bookshelf now. Visitors notice it occasionally. Most days I don't. Because the award was never the real reward. The real reward was learning that my value didn't depend on whether someone else recognized it. Not a husband. Not a boss. Not even a room full of admirals. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or dismissed, I hope you remember this. The people who fail to see your worth don't get to define it. And sometimes the most powerful thing you can do is keep showing up until the truth speaks for itself. If this story meant something to you, consider sharing it with someone who may need that reminder today. The end.